Appamada's programs and facilities are supported through your generosity. Your support really does make a huge difference. You'll find a link for contributions on the website at appamada.org/contribute. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for being here today. Very grateful to be able to share this morning with you. I'm just going to read something from a book by Nancy Mujo Baker in a moment. But first I want to just speak to the fact that people in Austin who had connections with Carolyn are missing her and are feeling the reverberations of her loss this week. And given that, it can seem trivial, even I don't know. It's just, how do you go on after a loss? You know, all of us have to do it. We do it all the time. But I just wanted to speak to that. So what I want to read is from a book by Nancy Mujo Baker called Opening to Oneness. And it's a book about the precepts. And it's about 4 pages long. And I'll have a couple of questions at the end. But they have to do with the precepts, but really a much broader question than the precepts is how can we open ourselves to oneness? And so this is late in her book. She's been covering the precepts one by one, the grave precepts and the pure precepts, which I won't recount here. But she then turns to the way that Dogen describes the precepts, which is a much more open way of talking about them than even the way that Diane Rossetto Harrison talks about them. And she's talking about it, and Dogen is talking about it in terms of oneness and lack of separation. So I'm just going to start reading here. Having talked about other ways to move toward oneness with the precepts, I hope that I'm actually quoting from her now. I hope you have begun to sense what it could mean to be one with a precept. All we have to do is to notice our language here. There are many different words in both secular and religious contexts used for ethical precepts, principles, injunctions, rules for proper conduct, commandments, prohibitions, norms, standards, and still more. In all these cases, the precept or principle is treated as in some sense outside of us, separate from us, and is used as a standard or guide for proper conduct, telling us what we should do and should not do. That separation can be seen in the language we use for our relation to precepts. Follow, keep, adhere to, or observe. Something like the 3 pure precepts and the 10 grave precepts of Zen can be found in every religious tradition or path. Something like them is also to be found as secular ethical principles or norms of behavior in every culture. Such precepts or principles can always be related to in 3 distinct ways. When precepts are taken in either the absolutist, never ever violate them sense, or in the relative to context sense, we have some version of a dualistic relation to them as described above. In the third, non-dual way of taking the precepts, to be found in Western mystical traditions, and in the Dogen Zen we are considering here, they have, in a certain sense, ceased being precepts. We are in the realm of no separation, and therefore are one with the precepts. It may be helpful here to consider the following analogy. Imagine you're part of a dance group, and the choreographer has come up with a new dance and written down its choreography. You have its score, and while holding it in your hands, you use it to help you go through the proper motions in relation to the other dancers and the music. The score, and especially at first the choreographed moves it calls for, are separate from you. Eventually, you are able to internalize the score and carry it around in your head to be mentally consulted when needed. It's still separate. Finally, you are one with it, and the dance happens automatically. If you penetrate it even further, there are likely to be moments when the dance not only happens spontaneously, but seems to come from a place where there is no dancer, no doer, no me, and even no dance. The dance goes on, but it is no longer conceptualized, and thus no longer something a describable me is doing. Each dancing moment is free of past and future, and free in all senses of the question why. As in, why are you doing it this way? The answer is no longer because the choreography says to do it this way, but rather, I just am. According to Zen, this type of transformation can occur in all aspects of life, including with the precepts. I suspect that all of us have had the experience of naturally or spontaneously expressing the heart of one of the precepts without the separation of should I or shouldn't I, and without a why. The question why only makes sense when there is separation between the one who acts and the precept. In those cases, there is an answer such as, because it is the right thing to do. Neither my student mentioned in chapter 14, nor the New Zealand woman mentioned in chapter 18 were functioning with a why, and because it is the right thing to do. Perhaps we can now understand in a new light Dogen's teaching. When we sit zazen, what precept is not observed? What merit is not actualized? As noted above, for Dogen, zazen or sitting meditation is not a means to the end of enlightenment, a way or a path to enlightenment, but rather an expression of enlightenment. Like a face and its expression, they are one. At this stage, the precepts, which are intrinsic to enlightenment and not the result of enlightenment, arise naturally and spontaneously. We are one with them, having left the realm of the conceptual and entered the realm of suchness. We are their embodied manifestation. It is here that it only makes sense for us to use non instead of not or don't. So she's using the phrase non-lying instead of not lying. So we are simply living our life in a way where we are not breaking the precepts against not lying. We are non-lying. At this point, we can ask, Sensei Baker says, at this point, we can ask, how do we get there with the precepts? Here, the Zen practice of no preference is valuable. This is what the practices with the precepts in part 1 are all about. Can I so deeply allow the killer or the liar in me that I cease the pattern of attachment and rejection by making them opposites of the exclusionary not version of each precept? Can I so deeply allow those qualities that I cease the pattern of attachment and rejection by making them opposites of the exclusionary not version of each precept? I'm sorry, that's a difficult sentence for me, so that's why I read it twice. One way for us to understand the use of non instead of not with the Zen precepts is to remind ourselves of Master Senchan's poem, Faith in Mind, or as we call it at Appamada, Shinshinming, in which he writes, "The great way is not difficult for those who have no preferences." As we read it at Appamada, the great way is not difficult for those who are not attached to their preferences. The preferences meant here, liking and disliking, grasping and rejecting, are due to comparing mind, to setting up better against worse. In order to do that, as we've seen, we have self-consciously to take something to be this as opposed to that, with a slight element of preference. This is the beginning of separation. On first reading the beginning of the Shinsenmin, many people mistakenly think it's prohibiting preferences so that I can no longer prefer vanilla ice cream to chocolate, or lying to not lying. That is not at all what is meant here. It is rather the attachment to one thing and rejection of another or many others that is being addressed. The attachment. It's the same with other people too. I can definitely prefer my candidate to yours or the company of one person to another, but can I do so without attachment and rejection? Can I be aware of my preference or opinion without creating polarization? I am separating when I am when I am one pole of a polarization. They are Republicans, and I am definitely not one of those. They are Democrats, and I am not one of those. But I am also separate when I treat things or persons as opposed to one another in a polarized sense. Political parties as mutually exclusive, definitely not free to intermingle. As Dogen reminds us, we mistakenly do that with delusion and enlightenment. And this is the meaning of his statement. There is no delusion that obstructs great enlightenment. Delusion and enlightenment are non-opposed. When I treat things as mutually exclusive, I exclude myself from them. I become separate from them. Again, quoting from Dogen, this is like binding oneself without a rope. This is like binding oneself without a rope. Not only do I become bound without a rope, but so do they. Everything is then boundaried and obstructing everything else. It is the same with the precepts. I can be attached to should not steal and reject stealing. Right there, I am creating a dualism of opposites, a polarization. I can never be one with a precept in that state. Moreover, this attachment to should and should not can, of course, make us powerfully judgmental. I remember as a 10-year-old child going with my 2 years younger brother and 4 years younger sister to Woolworths to get something for our mother. We told our sister to stay with we told our sister to stay by the candy counter while we went searching for whatever we were supposed to get. We got back to her and we were all set to return home, but she couldn't move for some reason. We noticed one arm behind her back. It turned out she had stuck her hand into a small opening in the glass cover and was holding a fistful of candy. The opening was too small for her fist, but not for her hand. She would have to let go of the candy, and she refused to do so. Once we finally got her to let go of the candy, we two older know-it-all siblings were perfectly horrible to her, accusing her of stealing without any let up all the way home. Given the way we treated her, you'd think she had been guilty of embezzling money from an organization designed to help the poor. My brothers and my relationship to the temptation to steal, both our own and other people's, was clearly in the polarizing not category. So that's where Nancy Baker ends the reading. And I really love that last anecdote, that the reverberations of the thought. We can hold things in our fist, but that will keep us bound without a rope. We can let go, and then we can have freedom of movement. And that this is analogous to the point that she's making about relationship to any and all of the precepts, that we can spend all our time not doing something and judging ourselves, judging others in relation to how we act in those things. Or we can be free, as in the Shin Ming, free to release our preferences about that, while still having a way of acting in the world that is in alignment with the precepts, where we are one with the precepts, one with the decision to realize that we want some candy, and yet that there'll be consequences if we clench it in our fist. Realizing that we want to be loving to others, but then realizing that by grasping that so hard, we can tie ourselves up in a knot, as it were. That there's some way in which grasping is just the thing to pay attention to. So that concludes what I wanted to talk about today. I just chose this because it speaks very much to me. I'm leading Appamada's Precepts group meetings this year, and we will have one of the meetings this afternoon. And I, just for myself, I spend a lot of time evaluating my own actions and evaluating the motivations behind my actions. And then every once in a while I'll think, boy, that's a really small-minded way to go about it. That I'm not small-minded in the colloquial sense, but in the sense of like, oh, I'm in my small mind wanting to have things work out the way I want. And what Dogen provides is a way to connect even with action in the world, not just thought, but action in the world in a way that is in big mind. And that, as you know, in that beautiful phrase, in Zazen, what precept is not being honored? They are all honored in Zazen. That in being present and acting in accord with our Buddha nature, that we are honoring all the precepts all the time. And that is our true nature. It's our, I'm a former Catholic, as you may have heard me mention several hundred times. But as a former Catholic, it's really hard for me to believe that that's my real nature. But I'm coming around. There was actually, I'm going to take off in a little different direction for just a few minutes here. One of the calendar quotes that I suggested for this year is a poem by Adam Zagajewski, a poet who died in 2021. And just before he died, this poem was published, which begins, "The great poet Basho prepares for his journey." And he, in the poem, which I don't have handy, but Zagajewski describes some writings by Basho in one of his early books, not his late famous book, the Journey into the North, but one of the early books, in which he describes going by a crossroads where there is a child who has been abandoned. And Basho gives him what food he can, and then he says, "It is the will of heaven." And he goes on. And then that night, he goes to a drinking party, and they write poems, and they have fun doing poetry things like poets did in medieval Japan. And a member of the Sangha said, "That seems like such a terrible lesson, so it seems to portray Zen in this cold-hearted light." And my response to her was to say, yeah, that there's a way and there's a temptation for us to withdraw into aesthetics, to withdraw into what's beautiful in as described in Zagajewski's poem about the calling of the birds as the sounds of the city fall away. And that we can make the mistake of dwelling in that place and forgetting that we are called into action every moment. But nevertheless, that action can be imbued with the sense of the big mind that allows us to see the humanity in others. Even though we cannot solve every problem, even though there's loss and illness and death all around us, still we are called on to do what we can moment by moment. So that's where I've got to stop. I'd be happy to respond to any questions or reflections on what Nancy Baker was sharing. John?
So this idea of oneness was totally foreign to me until I came into practice with Zen. And I appreciate when you said, you're still working with it. Yes, I'm definitely still working with it. There were two things that occurred that really helped me get a little farther in exploring this. And one was through Insight Timer that I used before we had online sitting. When I wasn't in the Zendo, I would use Insight Timer. And I have this friend in Brazil, and his little saying that he had was, "There are no others." And that just really, was one of those slaps across the face on this, there are no others. And sometimes I'd say, "Well, hope you have a good day," or something like that. And he'd say, "May all beings turn to the happenings of day with joy," or whatever, that he would then turn that to "there are no others." And another time that I learned something was about this was in inquiry. And Jim Williams talked about a counselor he had who said, "Every time you want to say they, say we." And I have practiced that, and that just turns it all. They are, threatening our democracy. We are threatening our democracy. It just has meant so much in that dealing with this. Not that I've gotten there, and I really appreciate this person that you read talking about it in terms of the precepts, because the precepts could be the most dualistic thing we have, And she said, she's warning us not to make it dualistic. And yet this discernment that we have, this judging, is very important for the precepts. It's how we decide what is wholesome, what is for the well-being of all. But it's that it is balanced with the other to come to the middle way, which she described as saying non-lying, so that we can see what is lying and what isn't, and so that we can decide our action. But it is what's always confounded me, and I work with the paradox that we see, that judgment is separating, yet we need judgment. We've got to have them both. We've got to have them both, and then choose the middle way. I'm working on it.
John, thank you. I think you're just as your Brazilian friend indicated, and your embrace to say we instead of they is that middle way. It's not denying either position. It's not clinging to either position, but it's acknowledging that it is we, that we act together, and that is true in the biggest sense and in the operational sense as well. The kind of like, how are we going to move through any difficulty? Thank you for saying it that way. That's great. Lisa, hi.
Well, that was a really rich reading. I really appreciated it, and I hope you'll share the author's name, so I can see it spelled. Yeah, I have quite a few thoughts about it. I think one of the things that stands out for me is this story about the abandoned child, and how is it a Zen master or a Zen disciple goes on past that abandoned child. And, it really hurts me, because I can imagine how that child would feel. And it applies to so many situations. So I wonder what the middle way is there. Going past the child and thinking it's the will of God, which, as I'm speaking, that reminds me of something I always objected to, growing up. That phrase or that attitude, sometimes of people who were deeply religious, saying it is the will of God. And what it is bringing up in me is how cynical I was about that. I mean, that was part, of my family of origin stuff. We don't believe in that kind of stuff, the will of God. We aren't sure about God. We aren't sure about punishment. When I hear the phrase, the will of God, it always has a negative load for me. It's not, I think of something that's a trauma, or something that's hard to bear or impossible to bear. And trying to take that on as the will of God. And now, as this is unfolding in my mind, it's almost associated with having no preferences, or not being attached to your preferences. And then, as this continues to unfold, it could also be an excuse for inaction, as this individual who passed the abandoned child. It's like a lack of compassion. It's questions, what is our responsibility to the world? It asks, it's separating myself from the child. It brings up so many ethical issues. And it reminds me of a story I've heard frequently about a student of Zen, or a monk, who was so, he practiced in solitude. And during his practice, a young girl brought him food. You know the story. I don't have it quite right, but this beautiful young girl, brings him food during his sitting, that he needs. And he ignores her. She repeatedly brings him food, and he just does not acknowledge her in any way, just as the man passing the child did not acknowledge that child's need. So his teacher, finally says to him, why are you ignoring this person who's offering these sustenance? And I think at that point he realizes, oh, this is not, we're interdependent. This solitary practice, it can be an exclusionary practice. And it can be a practice where we don't acknowledge others, maybe because we're protecting ourselves or feel threatened in some ways. Maybe it would make it us vulnerable. So both of these people, they're adopting something I think that's so easy for us. It's like we want to be safe. We want to protect ourselves from these feelings that might arise. Whereas being deeply human and caring is acknowledging them. So that's, just bringing up a lot for me and about what is moral, what is ethical, and when do we fail to see our oneness? Because it's so darn challenging. It's challenging. It's easier to hold on to the candy of not my business, and to let go and be expansive. So thank you, Joel, for that reading.
Thank you, Lisa. Let me say, I put into chat the name of the author and the first part of the name of the book. And I'll say it for those again in the Zendo who might be interested. The writer's name is Nancy Baker, and her Zen name is Mujo, M-U-J-O. So the book is listed as Nancy Mujo Baker. It's called Opening to Oneness. And it's a very challenging book. It's a collection of her Dharma talks over the years. And she joins this contemplation of moving from the not to the non, talking about Bodhidharma, talking about Dogen, and they're called to embrace the precepts in big mind, where you are not separate, where they're not just commandments that are out there that you're not connecting with, and like that, and going to a place where you are one with the precepts. And she joins that with some very challenging exercises that I found very difficult to deal with at first, but they're making more sense in the context of this chapter. But she says, if there's a precept that in the exercises that she says, if there's a precept like not killing, sit with somebody else in a small group and spend 15 minutes with that person asking you, how are you a killer? And no crosstalk. And just keep with that question for a considerable length of time. And the same thing with stealing, the same thing with lying, etc. And that seemed like not something I would recommend to the people participating in the precepts class this year, for example, as a beginning practice. I imagine her in a quasi-monastic situation where people are very close to each other and can know that the person interrogating them in this way is doing so out of love and connection. But that assumes a lot, that if I were to do that with another person, I would be assuming a lot that they could stick with it for a long time like that. and then to kind of repay the favor without having disruptive emotions come up. So it is a wonderful book and a challenging book, and I know other people in other groups are working with it. It's being used in the Madison Sangha right now, their precepts, and it's well worth integrating into precepts practice, I think. So thank you. Does that feel complete, Lisa?
Yes, thank you.
Gabriella?
Yeah, thank you so much for bringing this. I've seen in different places this reflection of how to move from polarization. And I've seen people talking more about spectrums and the exploration of how we are everything, yeah, and how we can flow from one to the other. And yeah, just really supports this awareness of we are everything, yeah. It's like we want to separate ourselves to say, okay, we are in this side of the good and we're none of that, but that makes us split inside and makes more complicated also to relate with others, yeah, like saying, okay, all these things that I don't want to see, it's outside, and then it's you and all the other people, and how to integrate that we are human and we have all of that, yeah. Like in the chant we pray, yeah, we have all the ancient twisted karma, and yeah, just want to thank you for sharing this. I think especially when we want to be really, good and compassionate, how important it is to hold that we also have this shadow, and how can we be comfortable with it instead of blaming ourselves or feeling guilty or trying to hide even from ourselves, yeah. So yeah,
I think that's exactly what Joan was speaking to as well. This turn from whenever we can so Joan, you were quoting Jim Williams
Yes.
when you said the turn from they to we. Is that right?
Yes.
So wherever we're going to say something about they or them, that we substitute we and us. And I'm reminded that in the right use of power, there are somatic exercises where you get up and you move around and you do things. One of them is to just say, pick a quality of being like extroverted or introverted. And you imagine a continuum, a line that you can stand on. And at one hand, at the right extreme, there's extroversion. And at the left hand extreme, there's introversion. And that you literally move along the line until it feels uncomfortable one way, uncomfortable another way, and then you find the place where it's most comfortable for you, and that is your position on that line. And that strangely, that you can evaluate where you are by what's coming up in your body as you move along an imaginary continuum. What strikes me about that is how freeing it is that you say, oh yeah, I'm comfortable here, but that doesn't mean there's anything wrong with being at another end, at one end or the other. It's just a position on a continuum where I feel comfortable right now. And that to me was an exercise that freed me to see. I did it with other people who were moving back and forth on a line in the same room. And it freed me to appreciate their moving toward where they felt comfortable, in that place. it wasn't necessary to justify anything. It wasn't necessary to see one as better than the other or something. It's just where we found ourselves at that moment. And that changed things in with regard to what I saw for myself, and more importantly, I think, with regard to how I saw other people. So there's a very simple kind of exercise that way. Thank you.
Thank you.
Becky.
One, it just keeps going back to there.
No, you're still,
Oh, okay.
you're staying unmuted.
Okay, good. It's nice to be heard. One of the things I was thinking about through that is that we recognize that animals don't have these conflicts going on, but we are animals. And it's our evolutionary process that has put us in this place where we are so far off from the Buddha way. Because like where we are now in time have been many, many, many centuries of the conquerors overtaking what was the society that had been there and made it absolutely that these are the things that you can and cannot do, and these are the, and all of the dualities involved in that have then made themselves at home in our brains and in the way that we're set up. And so I think we need to kind of remember that along with the ways that we ask those other questions to ourselves about the idea of our not connection to each other, nor to the whole broader life. And I think that that's a place where we need to not take it on personally, but to move through it, to recognize, because I don't think we're responsible for creating it. And it's so big that we almost can't imagine how to let go of duality and other aspects of our separations inside of ourselves as well as amongst each other. And so I think that we need to remember that so that we don't feel bad about ourselves about that, I mean, like, the Xintian Ming has that statement that says the struggle between good and evil is the primal disease of the mind. And that is the place where we think we are us as me individually.
Mm-hmm. There are other translations which, instead of using the word good and evil, I've seen where it's translated more like the struggle between what we want and what we don't want is the primal disease of the mind, which has, to me, a different valence, but is still connected with.
Well, yes, evil and good is pretty like extreme thing, but what it's saying is that when we, and the other ones that where you're gonna, have a hair's breadth between heaven and earth,
Right.
all of those are based in recognizing the dualism that we experience and the ways that we don't move smoothly with our own life, never mind the minds around us.
Right. Well, thank you for highlighting that point. That's really very important. I talked, it seems like 100 years ago, but I talked at Inquiry last week, or two weeks ago. And I remember reading a quote from Coshin Paley Ellison from his book Untangled, in which he quotes a Jewish teacher who says, "It is not up to us to complete every task, but it is up to us to do what we can, to embrace what we can." And you know that the example of the terrible thing of the child beside the road, that and you know, every homeless person I pass and don't do anything about, that you know, I give money to agencies. I volunteer with a couple of agencies in Albuquerque, none of which have any direct impact on the misery of the person that I'm driving by in my comfortable car, you know. But that we have to be able to work in this world in ways where we can do something, but not be broken by the fact that we can't solve very, very big, omnipresent problems. So I think that's a very important point. And there's something that points back to what everybody else has said, what Lisa said, what Gabriella said, what Joan said, that it is that if we go beyond me and you to we, that gives us a path. That gives us a path where we can care for ourselves and for others. Now, this is getting more and more tangled for me as I speak. I should be quiet.
But the part that wasn't there was recognizing the compassion is part of how we aren't separated.
Mm-hmm.
We allow ourselves to be part of the we.
Mm-hmm.
And
Exactly.
and that I find is really helpful, that almost anything I run into like that, where I experience that separation, that the first thing I invite for myself is to say metta inside myself,
Mm-hmm.
to be in that place that we know we are not separated.
Thank you. Thank you for that teaching, Becky.
I'm really happy to that you brought the precepts and the oneness together, and the duality, because I was thinking that the precepts could be, you know, kind of a setup for striving, which, you know, keeps us separate, you know, and if we're striving to be this way, then it's that could be just as bad as being the way that we don't want to be. They're just the other side of the same coin. And yeah, that's really all I want to say, the striving part. And yeah, that intention would seem to be a more it doesn't really get at the oneness, but it seems to be a way of approaching what we're looking for, versus desire, that kind of striving and desire. That's all I want to say. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Rosemary. All right, well, let us close.